and relegated them to behind-the-scenes paperwork. Anthony, as dedicated to the cause as the most dedicated man, became frustrated and impatient. She was beginning to listen to her friend Elizabeth Stanton when she told her the fight for women's rights was the real fight. It was the issue that affected every other. Finally, exasperated with her restrictions in the Temperance Society, she shifted her heart and energy for the final time to the cause of the emancipation of women. One of her first goals, because of her own personal experiences, was to reform the education system. She campaigned for women's rights in the New York Teachers Association and forced through a vote that allowed female teachers to share in all the privileges and deliberations of the organization. By the time she was in her 30s, Anthony was committed full-time to the women's movement. At first, she played a secondary role to Elizabeth Stanton, who was older and had been leading the movement for years before Anthony arrived on the scene. But gradually she became the guiding energy and intellect in the group. They were in some ways an unlikely pair, even to look at. Stanton was short and plump, with twinkling eyes and curly hair. Anthony was lanky and angular, with a serious expression and spectacles. But they shared brilliant minds, dedication, and the courage of conviction. For much of this time, Anthony lived with Stanton and her lawyer husband, so they could work together more efficiently. They wrote speeches, organized local groups, drafted petitions, and went on the road to try and drum up support and help raise women's consciousness. It was a demanding life, particularly so for Stanton, who was also raising 7 children. Frequently, it was Anthony who stayed home and took care of the children and household chores, so that Stanton, who was a better speaker, could go campaigning. Anthony was dubbed an old maid by now. In those days, women not married by 30 were considered to have missed their chance. Most were married by their early 20s at the latest. She was ridiculed by male opponents, as feminists often were, as having adopted the women's cause because she was so unattractive to men. This, of course, was absurd. In truth, Susan B. Anthony had many suitors when she was young, but had been put off by the institution of marriage itself, which she felt doomed women to a life of drudgery and confinement. She came to feminism, as all the early crusaders, from a genuine sense of injustice and a burning desire to liberate her gender. In the 1850s, Anthony and her colleagues found a uniform to express their cause: bloomers. Bloomers were really loose trousers gathered at the ankles and worn underneath a dress. They were named after the feminist Amelia Bloomer, a friend of Anthony's, who publicized them in the paper she edited at Seneca Falls. The beauty of the bloomers was that they replaced the tight, uncomfortable corsets women had been locked in for generations. Thus, they became a symbol, a protest against not just constricting clothes, but constricting attitudes. Women in the 1800s put on bloomers in much the same spirit that women in the 60s took off bras. When Anthony donned her bloomers, she also cut off her luxurious brown hair as further protest against stereotypes. Unfortunately, the bloomers were too effective. She, like other feminists, found that the public was paying too much attention to the costume and not enough attention to the issues. Young boys in particular liked to follow women wearing bloomers and repeat the popular and derisive chant, "Jibbery, jibbery, gab, the women had a confab," and demanded the rights to wear the tights, "Jibbery, jibbery, gab." Distressed by how her fashions had become more important than her words, Anthony went back to the bulky layers of long skirts and petticoats. In the year 1866, Stanton and Anthony founded the American Equal Rights Association in order to work for women's suffrage. The early work in the women's movement was slow and frustrating. It was held back by lack of funds as much as from opposition. To Anthony, the root of the problem was obvious. Few women had money of their own to donate to the cause. She decided it was time to take the issue directly to the state legislature and force a bill that would alter the status of women, at least in New York. Right off the start, she told the legislators that she would be back every year, year after year, until such a bill was passed. And that's exactly what happened. Every session, for 10 years, the legislators expected Anthony at their door, and every session she was there. For all those years she lobbied tirelessly, traveling about in all kinds of conveyances and weather, spending long nights writing and working over tedious details, and journeying to other states where women had taken up the crusade. Then, in 1860, just as the nation was about to head into a civil war fought for the rights of another minority group, New York passed a law making the first changes in the status of women. It stated that a married woman could control her own property, her own earnings, would have joint guardianship over her children, and would be granted many of the other economic demands Anthony and her colleagues had fought so hard for. Inspired by this victory in New York, women's groups in several other states began campaigning for similar bills, many of which were enacted. Throughout all her campaigning, Anthony had to endure vicious and often personal attacks by the media and by opponents. The New York World described her as lean, cadaverous, and intellectual, with the proportions of a file and the voice of a hurdy-gurdy. A Detroit reporter wrote, "If all women's writers look like that, the theory will lose ground." Anthony maintained her dignity throughout these attacks and was far more concerned with the assaults on the issues themselves. The New York Sun scoffed, "What are the rights which women seek? The right to do wrong." Many a woman slammed the door in her face, too, snapping, "I have all the rights I want. I have a husband to look after me." So much opposition was there that in some towns Anthony was denied the use of meeting halls. One 13-year-old girl who went to hear her recorded in her diary, "Susan B. Anthony talked very plainly about our rights and how we ought to stand up for them, and said the world would never go right until the women had just as much right to vote and rule as the men. I could not make Grandmother agree with her at all, and she said we might better all of us stayed at home." Grandmother wasn't the only problem. The press and the legislators were an even bigger problem. One lawmaker wrote in response to her efforts, "The ladies always have the best places and choicest tidbits at the table. They have the best seats in the railroad cars, carriages, and sleighs, the warmest place in winter and the coolest in summer. If there is any inequality, the gentlemen are the sufferers." When he read this to the legislators, the entire room burst out laughing. With the start of the Civil War, Anthony found her thoughts divided between women's rights issues and the issues of abolition. The radical abolitionists with whom she'd once worked opposed Lincoln's election at first because he was trying to prevent the war. They wanted immediate emancipation and saw the war as the only way this could happen. But soon she broke away from the abolitionists, chiefly because most of them refused to support women's rights. Once, a well-known abolitionist named Samuel May, who resented her attempts to attain legal and financial rights for married women, said to her, "You are not married. You have no business to be discussing marriage." She responded, "You, Mr. May, are not a slave. Suppose you quit lecturing on slavery." As the war raged on, women decided to call a moratorium on their own campaign for equal rights. Anthony retreated to her father's farm to wait out the battles at Fredericksburg, Antietam, and Gettysburg so she could resume her own battles. But in the meantime, she suffered a painful and unexpected defeat in the New York legislature. The legislature, taking advantage of the moratorium on women's rights efforts, suddenly voted to repeal part of the law they'd voted in only 2 years earlier, the part about women's guardianship over their own children. Anthony felt betrayed and helpless. Her frustration was made even worse by the dullness of farm life after so many years of activity and challenge. She wrote in her journal, "Tried to interest myself in a sewing society, but little intelligence among them." To keep her intellect sharp, she read the novels of George Eliot and poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, but mostly she waited. The wait was over in 1863, when President Lincoln released his Emancipation Proclamation, giving feminists a new forum for their own issues. "If slaves can be freed, women can be freed," said Anthony. "If this is a government by the people, for the people, then those people must include females." With Stanton at her side, Anthony organized large numbers of women to fight for a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery, an issue they felt was deeply tied in with their own. An amendment for black people could surely be followed by an amendment for female people. Stanton and Anthony gathered so many signatures, they ended up playing a key role in the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in America. But when they read the follow-up amendments, the 14th and 15th,